You're watching PM Agenda as the news this afternoon has broken that the most senior Australian fighting with ISIL appears to have been killed there in Syria. The Senate this afternoon passed the latest round of anti-terror laws, the so-called Foreign Fighters Bill. There's a third tranche to come. This is the so-called metadata retention bill as well. The government wants this through Parliament by the end of the year. Green Senator Scott Ludlam joins me now to talk about some of these things. Can I just start on the news, and thanks for your time, that Muhammad Ali Barrialai appears to have been killed, the first and most senior Australian fighting with ISIL that we know of. Do you welcome that news? How do you react to it?
I don't think you'll welcome a death of anybody, but it does underline the risks of Australians who are considering travelling overseas. The Syrian civil war has killed tens or hundreds of thousands of people and displaced many, many more. Now it's spilled into Iraq. If you wanted any more of an object lesson in just how violent that place is now, here it is.
And this all gets back to whether there's strong enough deterrence to stop people going there. Do you think there is at the moment?
I don't think the kind of legislative deterrence that the government has passed with the opposition support really cuts to the chase. I think actually the kind of de-radicalisation proposals that we are putting up that's got quite strong support is more likely to actually peel off.
And what are they? Just remind me.
Young people. A lot of it's based on the work of Dr. Anne Ali out of Curtin University, which is working with families rather than with individuals or sort of umbrella communities. Working with individual families who fear, that particularly that young people might get peeled off and sort of seduced by the stuff they're seeing online. And it's been shown to be quite effective. Some of the ideas are borrowed from Germany, where a lot of people, a lot of people have travelled and returned.
There's no reason why you can't do that as well as declaring no-go zones, isn't there? The
no-go zones is problematic in the sense, and we just had this debate exhaustively in Parliament, and Senator Penny Wright has led that debate for the Greens as our spokesperson, in criminalising a much wider range of behaviour potentially than travelling across to be a combatant. I think there are problems with people travelling across to fight in those wars on any side, coming back to Australia with post-traumatic stress disorder or of being exposed to God knows what, violent situations. But the government has criminalised a much wider category of behaviour. Visiting friends in these huge parts of the world has now been criminalised. So most of our arguments on the Foreign Fighters Bill has been around this. There seemed to be the need to look as though you're doing something, even though we actually have laws. Some of the laws that we have are already perfectly adequate, and some of what the government's just passed with opposition support, I think is dangerous and disproportionate. And the government's expert on counter-terror legislation was saying they should be rolled back.
But did you accept, though, that for those Australians who have gone over there with ill intent, and we're told there's about 70 of them directly involved in the fighting, it is hard to prosecute them back here for what they're doing, murdering people, rape, the rest of it. It is hard to prosecute them back here.
Yeah, but the bill that's just passed doesn't even really directly go to that.
Well, if they've gone to a no-go zone, that's an offence.
Well, I guess we'll see if people are actually trying to come back. But the rules around gathering evidence over there have been difficult and have been pointed out by the National Security Legislation Monitor, and none of the amendments in the bill that just carried dealt with that issue. So, yeah, there's no doubt there's a legitimate public policy issue here, but I think what the government's done is gone way too far in the breadth and the scope of this bill.
But surely just on this point, and I will get to the next stage as well, the metadata, but if there's a tweet of them in the banks of the Tigris River in Mosul, as we've seen with the young ginger-haired jihadist, as he's called, that's some evidence, isn't it, that could lead to a prosecution for going to a no-go zone?
Yeah, entirely. I don't really particularly have an issue with that. It's the collateral. It's the people who have absolutely no interest in fighting on one side or another of these conflicts.
But there are some exemptions that you can have a legitimate reason for going there.
There are. We believe those exemptions are framed much too narrowly. Actually, to their credit, the opposition brought in, I think, a protective amendment, which the Greens voted for, which was still lost because of crossbench votes. So the crossbenchers, and to a degree the opposition, have been trying to improve these laws. The government thinks that it's right under all circumstances and has rebuffed those moves.
There is an element of the laws that passed today that media companies have an issue with as well, and we're going to, I should point out, going to talk later on in the program to a senior media figure about that. The metadata laws that are coming up next, well, just on that, do you think the government will be able to pass the third tranche here on retaining metadata this year?
Can I just pick you up on one detail? I don't think this is the third tranche of anything.
Right.
I think we've seen 2 national security bills have passed that we've got serious problems with, and the bill that the government proposes to bring in next is only peripherally related to national security. Hundreds of agencies already warrantlessly access metadata. The government's now proposing to add whole new warehouses full of material and force tech companies to store that stuff against their will in some instances. Whether that is brought in or not, I think very much depends on whether the Labor Party is prepared to actually stand up and fight it, along with the Greens and the rest of the crossbench. But I do dispute that it's really a national security bill.
Well, all the police commissioners, the former ASIO chief, and many others say this is crucial. It's been used in every counter-terror operation since 9/11.
Yeah.
Access to metadata, including the plot some weeks ago that was foiled. The legislation, at least we haven't seen the draft, but what they're talking about is requiring phone and internet companies to hold that for a set time, 2 years. What's so wrong about that if they can currently already access it?
Well, it's wrong on so many levels. I've got no problem in conceding that a wide range of agencies have legitimate use for this material, and metadata has been valuable for investigation since way before 9/11 for routine police work. The problem that I've got is that it's all being accessed without a warrant. It's been accessed.
But it is at the moment.
It is at the moment. The existing authorisation regime is broken.
So your problem's with the existing law, not
right.
What's being proposed.
The existing law allows hundreds of agencies to access private material on ordinary Australian citizens, whether they're accused of a crime or not, without a warrant. I've got a serious problem with that.
Is there any evidence that it's been misused?
It's very difficult to establish what it's being used for. It's, in some instances there are local governments that are using it to track down who put a billboard up. And it's all being done without a warrant and without any due process or oversight. So onto that regime that needs substantial reform and improvement to make sure that the access is legitimate and that there's some oversight, the government now proposes to add these 2 years, forcing companies to store material for an additional 2 years. So you've got 2 significant problems. Mandatory data retention hasn't been proved in Europe, where it was actually tried for a couple of years, to increase the clearance rates of crime or to make people any safer. The evidence actually runs against that. And it is, I think, entrenching a system that is already in need of reform.
Let me finally ask you about petrol excise.
Yeah.
What is your personal view on whether fuel taxes should be higher than they are?
There's 3 principles at stake. The Greens are supportive of indexing fuel excise, and we have been since 2001. But there's 2 other principles at stake. One is that you don't support regressive taxation unless you've got a very good reason to do so, because this hits people in outer metro areas, people on low incomes, people in regional areas harder. And the third one is the idea of increasing fuel excise is you plough that money into public transport or cycling infrastructure, anything that will give people alternatives. And this government, in their bloody-minded way, right after they were elected, cancelled all Commonwealth funding for public transport. So that's the problem that we have with this country.
What if the money just went into consolidated revenue, like any other tax?
If the Prime Minister has said that every cent that's raised is going to go into tollways and additional urban freeways, including the East-West link in particular, which is a hot issue in Victoria at the moment, or other freeways around the country, I've got a really significant problem.
What if they said it's just going into paying down deficit?
They can say it's going to whatever they like. The one thing that we can be certain of is that it won't be going into public transport. So let's see.
But would you support that if they just said it's going into consolidated revenue?
No, I wouldn't. If they insist on making petrol more expensive for people while taking off the table any alternatives, if you're putting a price signal into the market which applied with a carbon price,
so it must
go into
public transport or cycleways.
We've been saying that for months. Actually, we've been saying that for years. If you're going to put a price signal into the market to try and change behaviour, you've got to give people alternatives. Otherwise, it fails. You've just made life more expensive and not provided people with alternatives.
It is state responsibility, though, and local government responsibility, cycleways and buses and trains.
That's written nowhere in the Constitution. Under the previous government, just to give you one example, we had $500 million to go into the light rail project in Perth. That was wiped out. That was taken off the table. Similar public transport projects right across the country. The Commonwealth's got most of the taxing powers, and the states, quite frankly, without Commonwealth assistance, can't afford to do it by themselves. We'd actually made significant progress, and that was wiped out by this Prime Minister who says roads are good for mental health, we're going to stick to our knitting, we're just going to do roads. It's completely unacceptable. To then hit motorists for an increase, which is again, violates an election commitment that they wouldn't raise taxes on people, and not then provide those alternatives so people can change their behaviour if they want to, is unconscionable.
Green Senator Scott Ludlam, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. Take a quick break.